AP World, Lesson 9, Global Power Shifts circa 1450. Question 1. What major shift in trans-regional trading patterns was triggered by the collapse of the Mongol Empire? Despite its steady decline in the years prior to the Mongol invasion, the Abbasid Empire continued to be a crucial hub for trade between West Africa, the Swahili coast, Western Europe, and South Asia. The retreat of the Mongols did not result in a return to the status quo. The regional dynamic had evolved so much during the Mongol period that the Ottoman successors to the Abbasids would never be able to re-establish a complete monopoly on regional trade. By the 15th century, merchants from many societies were competing for roles in trans-regional trade. In the Mediterranean, Europe, and particularly Italy, merchants were increasingly active. In the Indian Ocean, Indian and Southeast Asian Muslims rivaled the commercial activity of their Arab neighbors. For 150 years, the interlocking khanates of the Mongol Empire had facilitated overland trade between China, the Middle East, and Europe. In this sense, the Mongols had assumed the facilitatory role previously filled by the Abbasid Caliphate. Mongol defeat in China in the later 14th century and increased regional pressures in Russia and elsewhere disrupted the previously stable Silk Road trade networks. Without the assurances of the Mongols to guarantee safe trade, overland commercial activity dwindled. Overland trade and its motivations did not disappear, but inevitably new emphasis would be placed on seagoing routes, particularly in the Indian Ocean. The era of land-based trade, and thus land-based empires, was coming to a close. The age of maritime trade was about to begin. Question 2. What was the greatest significance of the Chinese decision to halt their voyages of trade and exploration in 1433? What role might the scholar-gentry have played in ending Chinese outreach? Unquestionably, the course of world history would have been profoundly altered had the Chinese continued their voyages of outreach. In this scenario, the tiny European expeditions that would eventually make their way to the Indian Ocean would have been overwhelmed by the superior Chinese military and commercial organization. The Chinese voyages ended abruptly in 1433. The shift in Chinese policy unintentionally cleared the way for another, less organized civilization to establish its dominance. With the Arab states in decline, and now China permanently retreating behind its walls, Western expansionism began to take on new significance. Without a powerful counterweight in the Indian Ocean, the moderate advantages enjoyed by the Europeans had a magnified impact. There is no doubt that the continuing success of the Chinese state was due to the strength of the Confucian scholar-gentry. Their skill in harnessing the ample natural resources at their disposal positioned them as the elites in Chinese society. Their power, therefore, rested in their supervision of an agricultural economy that was naturally land-based. Were there to be an alternate stream of revenue, the power base of the CSG would be undermined. A thriving merchant class would dilute the influence of the Confucian scholar-gentry. There was significant motivation on the part of the gentry to limit the influence of a merchant class. With costs mounting from the continued fighting to expel the Mongols, the Confucian scholar-gentry was able to convince the emperor to halt the voyages, thus reasserting their preeminence. Question 3. Why did national or regional governments grow in strength and significance during the later medieval period in Europe? At the end of the 14th century, key advances in statehood were taking shape in European society. The strengthening of feudal monarchies provided more effective national or regional governments in much of Western Europe. The 100 Years' War between Britain and France prompted innovations in military organization, including non-aristocratic soldiers recruited and paid directly by the royal government, that enhanced centralized political power. Strong regional monarchies emerged in Spain and Portugal as Christian leaders pushed back against Muslim rule in the region. The growth of cities and urban economies concentrated wealth in central areas, and the political power followed. The commercial revolution spurred trade, which would eventually eclipse agriculture as the dominant source of economic power. Cities, generally speaking, fell under the authority of the king rather than the feudal aristocracy, and thus it was the king alone who would benefit from urban commerce. Similarly, overseas trade and then later imperial expansion also fell under the king's authority. A stronger monarch resulted, in many cases, in a more clearly defined national identity. Question 4. Describe the economic crisis that later medieval Europe was experiencing. How would this affect global patterns in the years to come? The Crusades whetted European appetites for luxury goods from the East, including spices, sugar, and silks. In return, Europeans had only rough, basic goods to trade. European offerings included honey, salt, copper, and wool. The value of European exports could never exceed the value of imports from the East, and consequently, the unfavorable balance of trade had to be made up using gold, of which there were only limited reserves. This hemorrhaging of gold created a quote-unquote gold famine that threatened to collapse the entire European economy. Compounding this financial crisis was the resurgent Muslim Empire, now ruled by the Ottoman Turks. The growing strength of the Ottomans meant that Europeans were once again forced to work with Muslim intermediaries in the trade of luxury Eastern goods. The fall of Acre, the last Crusader city, closed a window of time during which Europeans enjoyed a much more direct connection to the global trade networks. This trade deficit and increasing economic isolation incentivized risk-taking, which would spur exploration efforts that would result in a significant European presence in the Indian Ocean, Africa, and the Americas. The trade deficit meant that Europeans needed to find another means of acquiring the much sought-after luxury goods. They would quickly realize that they could acquire through force that which they could not acquire through trade. Question 5. What is the connection between religious devotion and imperialist tendencies in the Iberian Peninsula in the 1400s? The development of a vigorous military and religious agenda on the Iberian Peninsula intensified with the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The couple believed the government had a mission to promote Christianity by converting, expelling, or killing Muslims and Jews. Consequently, Ferdinand and Isabella enjoyed the enthusiastic support of the papacy. Close links between church and state resulted in church officials carrying out many of the bureaucratic functions of the state, and in return the state would support church causes and pursue doctrinal purity within the Catholic Church. The institutions of church and state would become further intertwined during the Spanish Inquisition, the legal apparatus by which religious orthodoxy could be enforced. Ultimately, the Iberian states were developing highly effective centralized governments with a particular emphasis on both religious mission and religious support. These changes contributed to the nascent European sense of exceptionalism and would directly promote the West's expansion into wider world contacts. Question 6. Who was Henry the Navigator, and why was he important? I'll begin with some caveats. Henry the Navigator was a Portuguese prince, but there's no evidence to suggest that Henry was a sailor himself or had ever led a maritime expedition. The famed Sagres school of naval expedition that he is said to have founded was likely a mere collection of navigators and explorers in his personal orbit. Portuguese success had much to do with ship design, the caravel, and cartographic borrowing from Genoese, Castilian, and Muslim sources. The mythologizing aside, Henry remains a pivotal figure. He financed voyages of exploration that rediscovered the Madeira Islands and the Azores, and that traveled further south along the African coast than had any before. More important than his financing of individual voyages of discovery is his insistence that voyages be launched annually. The idea that exploration would be a process rather than a haphazard gamble is Henry's truest contribution. The cumulative effect of this systematic approach to exploration would ultimately result in the Portuguese reaching the Indian Ocean. The subsequent arrival of other European powers would signal the beginning of the age of maritime empires. Question 7. Was the shift in the world order in the 15th century the result of deliberate acts, or was it simply the result of accidents and coincidence? It is tempting to ascribe some degree of deliberation or planning in the profound changes that began to occur around 1400 CE. A Western ethnocentric approach to world history would likely assume some inherent superiority of European values and would thus simplify the factors involved in order to highlight Western exceptionalism. It is much more accurate, however, to view the growth of European maritime empires as the result of a series of overlapping coincidences. The decline of the Mongols and the actions of the Chinese Empire in particular, in addition to developments in the Americas, are each individually explainable, but their alignment at a critical time was coincidental. The rise of the Mongol Empire established a permanent link, both commercial and intellectual, between East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The European appetite for exotic goods that this trade supplied was so large that, when the Mongol Empire contracted and there was once again a Muslim bulwark separating Europe from Asia, Europeans were driven to the unthinkable, brave the Atlantic Ocean in search of an alternate route to the source of these luxury items. The state of European politics in the centuries preceding the Portuguese arrival in the Indian Ocean was one of constant warfare, often between the French, the Spanish, and the British. Much of this conflict unfolded at sea, and so there was a particular emphasis on shipbuilding and navigation. The product of this proto-arms race was the caravel. The caravel was a product of very specific circumstances. Caravels were small, fast, light, highly maneuverable ships designed to survive in the turbulent waters of the North Atlantic. Portugal is situated on the eastern shores of the Atlantic, and as such was a naturally seafaring state. The waters of the North Atlantic are notoriously perilous, and the caravel probably evolved from fishing vessels capable of surviving those conditions. The caravel's small but sturdy design gave it a maneuverability better suitable for rough conditions, but more significantly, its use of triangular rather than square sails meant that it could sail into the wind, a technique known as tacking. The caravel was originally used for scouting or exploration purposes, but the Europeans eventually modified it to support heavy long-range artillery. When the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean, they quickly realized how superior the caravels were to the ships of the Middle East and South Asia, and that would be the basis for European naval domination for the next 400 years. The dominance of the caravel was predicated on the absence of serious competitors in the Indian Ocean. The Muslim and South Asian states had well-established maritime trade networks, but climate and geography meant that their ships did not have to be as robust as the caravel. The only possible obstacle to European dominance of the Indian Ocean would have been the Chinese Empire. The voyages of Chinese Admiral Cheng He demonstrated the Chinese capacity for naval superiority. Chinese ships, in both size and quantity, dwarfed those of the Europeans, and such was the wealth at the disposal of the Chinese Empire that they would easily have competed with the Europeans when it came to naval artillery. If the Portuguese had arrived in an Indian Ocean already dominated by the Chinese, they would have had little chance of success. As fate would have it, however, the Chinese halted their voyages of exploration in the 1430s, which left the Indian Ocean fatally vulnerable to European predation. Question 8. The patterns of global interaction that unfolded from the 15th century onward were determined by each society's willingness or ability to exist in a global world. Assess this statement. The various European states that would rise to maritime prominence in the 16th century, Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, the French, and the English, benefited paradoxically from the fact that they were small states on the periphery of the global economy. They also were in intense competition with one another. As a result, they were motivated to develop increasingly effective naval technologies and were desperate to use those technologies to accrue the prestige and wealth that would accompany overseas conquest. The Muslim empires of the Middle East had been from the very beginning at the crossroads of global trade, and their command of the spice trade was the basis for their centuries of domination over the Europeans. Their wealth, however, was based largely on overland trade routes, or maritime trade routes that did not venture beyond the coastal waters of the Indian Ocean. They certainly had the financial means to project power globally, but from their perspective, there was no need. The Indian kingdoms were even less interested in expanding beyond a provincial significance. They were the true hub of global trade, bridging the Spice Islands and China in the east to the Muslim world in the west. They grew incredibly wealthy simply by staying put and letting the money come to them. They had no incentive to expand. Finally, as previously discussed, the Chinese had probably the greatest capacity for global maritime dominance. They had the greatest shipbuilding and the wealth to fund exploration further and further from their shores. Dynastic change and fiscal prioritization ultimately ended the Chinese voyages by the mid-15th century. Chinese had the ability, but not the will, to develop a global presence. Ultimately, and ironically, it was the wealth and success of the Muslim, South Asian, and Chinese states that rendered them complacent and uninterested in disrupting the status quo, while it was the relative poverty of the Western European states that forced them into a gamble that, against all probability, would reward them in spectacular fashion.